Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So we're all waiting on the new FCC broadband maps, and unfortunately, when they come out, they're not going to be quite what we hoped. Thanks for joining me, Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So we are waiting on these FCC broadband maps because they are going to be what's required as far as determining exactly how much money each state's supposed to get. So each state knows that they're going to get $100 million. They've already applied for their planning funds, which will give them 5% of that. So that's $5 million to kind of get the planning going of beefing up their broadband office, hiring people for that, doing studies, maps, those kinds of things. So they know about that, but there's a big chunk of money that's waiting to determine how much each state's going to get, because it's going to be dependent on how many unserved areas there are in each state. And then however many they have, that percentage compared to what's across the total United States and territories determines how much each state or territory gets, with most of the remainder of those funds. So we're waiting on these new broadband maps from the FCC, and the FCC is shooting for November, mid-November or so, for those maps to come out, mid to late November. And we're kind of hoping that at that point that we would know, okay, well, now that we have these maps out, then the NTIA can take that information and then determine how much all the states are going to get. We can get this process going. But it's been determined that the maps are not going to be as accurate as we'd hoped. They'll certainly be way more accurate than the current maps, but they're not going to be as accurate as we'd hoped. And the NTIA has come out and said, you know, we're not going to be able to rely on the map data that comes out in November, because of the fact that it was pretty clear early on that there were going to be a lot of inaccuracies in the broadband fabric, which I'll explain here in a minute. So I was going to go ahead and just read through this story, just to kind of give you a little idea of what's going on and some background as well as we go through this. So you can see here, next update of FCC Broadband Map likely won't be a moment to celebrate, because again, it's not going to be what we had hoped here. So see, the next update of the FCC Broadband Map, expected in late November or early December, it's likely to have a considerable number of errors, according to sources familiar with the Broadband Data Collection Initiative, on which the map will be based. So what's been going on is, well, I'll explain as we go through here. It talks about some of this. So I'll add to this as we go. So it's an important issue as the government gets set to award tens of billions of dollars in funding to network operators to deploy broadband to areas where it's not available today. So this is all impacting the BEAD program, which is $42.5 billion or so that's going to be divvied up among the states and territories to provide broadband in unserved and underserved areas. The new map will be based on data collected from broadband providers. Those providers were required to enter broadband availability data on a per location basis into an FCC-provided database. The database, created by a company contracted by the Commission, was designed to provide address and geolocation information, latitude and longitude, for every broadband serviceable location in the country. So what they're talking about there is what they call the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. And this is the database. It's basically an underlying fabric of every broadband serviceable location in the United States. So the FCC contracted with a company called CostQuest to do that. CostQuest came out with the fabric, grabbing as much information as they could from aerial photographs, tax information, lots of different databases. They grabbed everything that they could and then tried to determine, once they had a plot of land and they could see the structures on there, which structures should have broadband. So that was the broadband fabric. And then during the period from June to September, service providers were mandated to upload the areas in the fabric where they provide service, and also some information about that, such as the maximum advertised upload speed, download speed, what type of service it is. Is it fiber, cable, wireless, for example? Is the latency 100 milliseconds or less? Number of units in a location? There's different information that they needed to upload into there. But it was determined early on that there were some issues with the fabric, which, you know, this is the first pass on the fabric. So I guess that's not too surprising that you would expect on the first pass of trying to get this incredibly huge database together of every single structure in the United States that should have broadband, that you would expect some errors. They say therein lies the problem. Nearly 90% of rural broadband provider members of NTIA, that's a independent telephone cooperative, really broadband cooperative these days. The Rural Broadband Association saw some Locations missing in the FCC database, said Mike Romano, NTCA Executive VP, in an interview with Telecompetitor. Another 2/3 of members saw extra locations, Romano noted. And I also did a survey. It was, not going to be as broad as the information they could gather, but we did survey a lot of our customers and prospects and found out that, from 41 surveys that were returned, that a lot of people were really struggling with the fabric because there were either inaccuracies in there or just trouble matching the data that they have in their database of who they serve, or who they can serve, I should say. Any address where they know they can serve with a standard kind of installation to the addresses in the fabric data. They were having a hard time matching that stuff. And we can see here that that's a lot of what's been noted here. So Paul Sulsford, product manager for Cooperative Network Services, a consulting firm that assisted 35 to 40 rural providers, a similar number that we surveyed, with their broadband data submissions, also noted problems with the location database, known as the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. He shared specifics from 3 anonymous providers. One provider saw 20% of his customer addresses match directly with the FCC database on the initial attempt to do so, while another provider saw 2.8% direct matches and a third saw 1.3%. So a lot of that has to do, that doesn't necessarily mean that the addresses are completely wrong, that, over like 98, 99% of these are wrong. But there were differences in the way the addresses were, as you can imagine. You might have First Street, F-I-R-S-T, street versus 1ST street, or you might have street spelled out versus ST. So if you're trying to match that stuff, even, the FCC provided help on how to do that in Excel, using Excel text matching and using a fuzzy logic plug-in with Excel and trying to be able to do that. But even that, when I went through that, I still had trouble matching those addresses that were off by a few characters here and there. So that, I think, is part of the problem. A series of address component and spatial filters were applied to the data to try to identify best case matches, and if that failed, a painstaking visual match was attempted. So again, you could try to do the fuzzy lookup match in Excel, but you still wound up having to go through and do this painstaking visual matching. Sulsford noted, for example, that when one provider traced the coordinates for one supposed broadband serviceable location, location was in the middle of a swamp. So that's an isolated incident. There's not that much of that, I'm sure, so they picked this particular situation. When I say there's not much of that, I mean, obviously in rural areas you're going to have more of that, but there are going to be situations like that. I don't think they're going to be wholesale swaths of area sitting in a swamp, but you might have some individual mistakes like that they noted here. Even after the visual match process, the 3 providers that Sulsford referenced were unable to find matches for between 1.4% and 9.7% of locations. So you can see here that it's not 90%, but in one case it's almost 10%, maybe a couple of cases, whatever that range is for those 3 providers, that they could not match up these addresses. So that means that maybe there were areas that were not in the fabric, or the provider had areas that they were providing service that they were providing service that were not in the fabric, or vice versa. That maybe there were areas in the fabric that the service provider said, wait a minute, we can't match up this address. It could have been, on a farm somewhere in some building or shack or shed or something. Who knows? So Romano had a similar story. One NTCA member tracked down a supposed broadband serviceable location that was found to be a large boulder. Well, that's really interesting because, again, part of what CostQuest had to do, they didn't go out and visit every single location, which you can imagine. So what they did was, in addition to using tax records, and some other things to identify what were the plots of land to look at, then they used satellite photography to try to determine, okay, which buildings look like the ones that should have broadband. So obviously, if you look at the satellite and you see what looks like a house, you'd say, okay, that needs broadband. Some other large structure might need broadband, or some other thing, roof line that looks like it would be. So they went through and they tried to teach the software how to do this. So they didn't obviously look at every single location as well. They couldn't visit it, and they couldn't look at every single location that came up in the satellite. But they looked at lots of them, and they then tried to teach the computer through kind of like an AI kind of algorithm to kind of do what they were doing, which is kind of referencing these different shapes and saying, okay, well, this looks like it should be a structure that should have broadband. So maybe this boulder was shaped in such a way that it looked like a roof line or some other structure that should have broadband. So that's pretty interesting that came up. So there's going to be some of that stuff. When the new map comes out in December, we shouldn't be celebrating, Romano commented. He hastened to add, though, that the upcoming update was destined to be incorrect. and advised against passing judgment on it until after a challenge process is completed. And that's true. I mean, you gotta take into account the fact that this is the first time we're doing this. And again, based on the way that they have to do this, you're going to have errors. NTIA realized the maps won't be done until a challenge process is completed, Romano said. He likely singled out NTIA because that agency will be responsible for the majority of the funding available for rural broadband deployments. And that's true. In fact, they are the ones that will be divvying out the BEAD program. So NTIA is the agency that is going to be using these maps to determine who's unserved and who isn't, what the percentages are, and what the states are supposed to get. And Alan Davidson, head of the NTIA, came out and said, we're not going to do this. We've decided we're not going to do this based on this first map that comes out in November, because he realizes there's going to be a lot of challenges and there's going to be a lot of changes to this. The FCC Broadband Map challenge process, there might have been fewer inaccuracies in the broadband location database if the FCC had conducted a challenge process for the location data before requiring providers to submit their data. Instead, the challenge process didn't start until September 12th, which was 11 days after the deadline for providers to submit their broadband availability data. The FCC undoubtedly opted for this approach. And by the way, the deadline was September 1st. And a lot of service providers, again, even just from our survey, we received responses from people that said, we're not going to be done by that date, because they were still trying to figure out how to do the matching, that kind of stuff. And I know a lot of service providers were in that situation. The FCC, up until last time I checked, they were still accepting the submission data, so it's not like they've cut that off at this point. At least they hadn't when I checked a few days ago. So this is something that is kind of an ongoing process, I think, for people. So again, the FCC undoubtedly opted for this approach because it's under pressure to get the broadband map updated as quickly as possible, in part because stakeholders want funding to be made available as soon as possible, and in part because the Commission has received ongoing criticism for several years about the inaccuracy of its broadband availability data. An entire census block is considered to have service even if only one location in the block has service available to it. So that's referencing the current process and the current maps, which use Form 477, which what that does is it collects the information from each service provider, and it's based on a census block. And it tells the service provider, do you offer service in the census block, and what's the speed? And if the census block has 50 locations, 50 homes, and they offer service to 10 homes, that whole census block is considered served. So obviously that's not good. So that's the whole reason that we're trying to do this location by location based map. But the FCC had to have money to do this, right? So the Broadband Data Act adopted in March 2020 directed the Commission to update the data, but funding for that initiative wasn't made available until months later. In fact, I think it was the end of the year. I think it was around December that they actually funded the Broadband Data Act for the FCC to be able to take the step of going through this and getting the fabric created and going through this whole process. The FCC also uncovered another concern. There was no definitive database of all broadband serviceable locations in the U.S. Accordingly, one had to be created, which also took time. So that was the fact that they had to have a contractor that would create this broadband fabric. And then one other thing that delayed things is CostQuest, again, was awarded this contract. And then another company initiated a challenge to that process and said, hey, for some reason they felt like they should have been awarded it, or maybe it wasn't fair or something like that. So that took place, and that delayed things several months. And finally that challenge was settled, and the broadband fabric from CostQuest was created and then supplied to all the service providers who then used it to upload their data. In fact, just the other day, I think I don't know if it was the final, but a court ruling upheld the fact that that challenge on who would create that fabric was not good. So maybe that would be the final nail in that process. Now that the challenge process has begun, and they're talking about the challenge to this bulk data. So what happened is again, I think it was September 12th, the FCC came out and said, okay, starting September 12th, you can start doing bulk challenges to this fabric. And a bulk challenge is one, it's not like saying, hey, this one address is wrong. You could do that. But what they're saying is this is not consumers going and saying, hey, my home says it's served and it's not. That comes later. This would be for the service providers who are uploading the data. This would be for cities, communities, tribal organizations, states, anybody that's kind of a stakeholder like that can upload a bulk challenge. For example, if there's a whole bunch of addresses that are not in the fabric, or some that are in the fabric that are wrong, those kinds of things, they can upload those in bulk and get those challenges in place. Now that the challenge process begun, Telecompetitor was surprised to note that the FCC didn't provide a deadline for submitting challenges. That's true, they didn't. They didn't say when in this whole challenge process that there's a deadline. They're just at some point going to, I don't think they'll announce one either. I think at some point they're just going to say, okay, we're going to have to cut this off now because we need to get the maps out in late November, early December, whenever they're deciding to do that. Nevertheless, only challenges submitted by a certain date will be reflected in the second iteration of the FCC Broadband Map, the one everyone hopes will be correct. The FCC just has not revealed that date. So in other words, the maps that come out in late November, early December, whenever that is, those are not going to be based on any of this challenge data. That's based on the data whenever the FCC is done saying to service providers, well, they haven't cut it off yet, but at some point they're going to cut off service providers being able to upload their serviceable locations into the fabric. When they cut that off, that's what the maps are going to be based on. So none of the challenges are going to be impacting that. That's just going to be what the service providers are saying. So this first map will represent the original fabric of where all the broadband serviceable locations are, or we think are, or most are. In other words, this first fabric that's not correct, plus all of the provider data that was uploaded on that as to where providers do provide service at those locations. So it's not going to be based on any challenge data. So the challenge data will not be reflected until the next map. According to Romano, every NTCA member he has spoken with has devoted a ton of time to try to reconcile the data, and he expects them to file their challenges promptly. He also expects to see challenges filed by individual states, as the amount of funding allocated to each state will depend on the number of unserved locations in the state. The bigger issue in my mind is the Commission adjudicating all the challenges, Romano said. There might be a tendency to say, let's deal with the bulk challenges. Romano hopes the Commission won't opt to hold off on addressing the smaller challenges, which he said are most likely to come from NTCA members. I'm not sure what that means, because NTCA members, those are the folks that right now that should be doing these bulk challenges, and he said most are going to be doing that. But the small challenges, the consumer challenges, will not take place until the first FCC map is out. The FCC has a webinar about the broadband data challenge process scheduled for this Wednesday, September 28th. That was yesterday? So maybe that's a second webinar. There was actually a webinar on September 7th, I believe, and I will link to that. So there was a webinar that the FCC did where it's pretty interesting. They talked about the fabric and how the fabric was created. They talked about the bulk challenge process. They showed, I think, in the application, in the FCC application for filing bulk challenges, how to do that. I also saw a shorter video that just covered the application and how to do that. So I'll link to both of those videos. I did not find this webinar that took place yesterday, so they probably have not posted that yet on their YouTube channel, but I will post the earlier one. I don't know if there's a difference between the two. And then later I may come back and post the third one. If I find that gets posted, that could be posted in the next, later today or tomorrow. So there you go. So again, the next process, the FCC map will come out November, December timeframe. So where that will be valuable is the FCC is supposed to open that up to consumers. So at that point, consumers can look at the new broadband map and say, let's see, what does it say that I'm supposed to be getting? And they can look and they can see, I think they'll be able to see which service providers say that they're providing service at their address, what that service provider is saying their maximum upload and download speed is their latency less than 100 milliseconds. And I think that's about what's going to be in there. I don't think there's going to be any other, like maybe if it's an apartment, how many units there are, those kinds of things. So it's basically going to be what the service providers uploaded on top of the fabric that contains each serviceable location. So consumers will then get a look at that. And consumers and others, anybody really, can then challenge that data on that FCC map. So it's going to be interesting because there's going to be a lot of these bulk challenges that are taking place. And does that mean that NTCA members or others will be going into the map and challenging stuff, even though they're challenging the underlying data? That underlying data will not be, or that data that they're challenging will not be reflected in this map. So I think there's going to be a lot of challenges kind of duplicated if service providers do that. So they should be challenging the data in the fabric. Consumers can challenge the data on the map, but we already know that the map is not going to be completely accurate. But if somebody says, if the consumer, if there is an address, that's the good thing about this is the consumer knows their address. If they're on a farm, they know, wait a minute, this is saying I have, gig fiber here and I don't. I've got DSL service and here's the speed. They can challenge that. So each consumer will know where they live, they'll know where they're supposed to be getting broadband, and they can challenge that data in the map. Then the next step is sometime around December, really 1st of January is when the next window will be for service providers to upload their data. So the FCC is going to take the bulk challenge data, they're going to update based on that. I guess, I don't know if they have to, I don't know how they confirm what's been challenged or not, but they're going to take whatever challenges they get and however they happen to confirm that, and they're going to update the fabric, and then that fabric is going to then be available for service providers to look at this updated fabric and then do the same thing. They're going to have to upload, they're going to have to match all of their addresses with the FCC addresses and location IDs, upload their serviceable locations. And this is going to be an ongoing thing, just like the Form 477 that collects the by census block data. This is going to be a biannual process, take place at the beginning of the year and then back and again in June of next year it's going to happen, and then again January the year after that. Every 6 months this process is going to take place. Now at some point service providers are going to have everything pretty well set, and then they're just going to be looking at what's changed in the last 6 months. So they're going to be looking at, let's see, how many new addresses, what did I open a new service area? Is there a new neighborhood here that we need to be providing broadband? That might show up, who knows, that might show up on the broadband fabric before the ISP even shows it as an area that they can cover. But there's going to be those kinds of things. So it is definitely an ongoing, continual process to determine who should be having broadband, because, places will come and places will go. In some cases, maybe neighborhoods go away. That's not very common, but it's going to be more likely that you're going to have new homes being built here and there, new neighborhoods coming in that are going to have to be represented on this map. So anyway, be interesting to see what we get in November, and then again the next set of maps probably not until spring of next year, because if you think about the timing of this, the FCC is taking a couple of months after they get the data uploaded from the ISPs, which again that was over in September. It's going to be November before they get the map out. Then they've got the new fabric coming out, let's say the end of December. They're going to give ISPs probably 2-3 months, probably 3 months to get that data in. So let's say that's in March that the ISPs upload their data. Then there's probably going to be a little bit of a challenge process from that as well, that new fabric. So it's going to be maybe May before we see the maps. So May of 2023 before we see these maps. So that all impacts when this BEAD money is going to be distributed. So don't forget, there's still dollars out there with USDA Reconnect. There's still dollars with ARPA. So USDA Reconnect, if you are a service provider, make sure that you reach out to your local USDA contact in your state and find out if there's anything you can get through that program. Reach out to your broadband state office for ARPA, because that money comes through the NTIA, I believe. Yeah, so go through your state office for ARPA funds. They may still have funds that they're awarding for broadband. That's money right now that is sitting out there that's available. So be looking at that to see what you can get, because it is going to be quite a while before we see these BEAD funds. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully this was interesting. If so, please give me a thumbs up on the video. I always like that. Give me a click subscribe if you're not subscribed. Click the little bell to be notified when I'm live. And if we can help you in any way with broadband services, check us out, zquorum.com. We provide a host of managed broadband services for service providers to make your life a little bit easier, to reduce costs, make your customers happy. There's lots that we do. We've been in business now since the early days, 1995, really before that, but 95 is when I joined the company, when we were a dial-up internet provider, and we quickly changed over to a wholesale service provider of managed services to broadband service providers. So check us out. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.